Okay, we'll move on to the next piece, which is also from a sarcophagus. It's actually the sarcophagus of a philosopher. So during these insecure times in Rome, many Romans became interested in philosophy, and their funerary art oftentimes depicted themselves as philosophers, basically. And this work depicts a seated Roman philosopher, and he's holding a scroll here at the center of the composition. And there are two women on either side of him, and in the background there are other figures, as you can see, mostly in profile here. And the two women are probably deceased family members, wives or daughters potentially. And the composition has this frontal central figure and then two subordinate flanking figures, which this is a typical composition that becomes widely used in the late Empire, and it's typical of the late Empire style. So that might be something to remember. And this type of sarcophagus became popular for Christian burials as well. And sculptors use this kind of wise man motif to portray not only the deceased, but also they often used it to portray Christ as well. And typically Christ would be flanked by saints instead of, in this case, this case is family members, but if this was Christ, he would typically have a saint on either side. So definitely a common compositional motif used in the late style, basically, late Empire. Okay, so we'll take a look at these ruins, and then also the restored view to the right of the Temple of Venus in Lebanon, 3rd century BCE. I believe that's Baalbek, Lebanon. And this is a significant work because it's an example of architecture during the 3rd century that's really deviating away from the classical Greek influence. And we keep on seeing that more and more as we move on through the late Empire, that deviation away from the classical Greek influence. And this is in present-day Lebanon, and the architect that did this, we're not sure who did it, but they call this the Baroque tradition, basically, which means they used Greek elements but ignored almost every rule of classical design. And the building is in many ways a critique of the concrete Parthenon, which by then had achieved the status of a classic. Many things about this temple are unique. The platform is scalloped all the way around. We can see the platform has these little scallop shapes, or almost like arch shapes carved into it, along with, I believe this would be the roof or pediment here. Actually, no, this is just the roof line that's also scalloped, which is very unique. And the columns are the only known instance of a 5-sided Corinthian capital with corresponding bases and their pentagonal bases, supporting a matching scalloped, entablature, which I think this would be the entablature then. And in here, there's another arch above. So very eccentric design. Okay, we'll talk about Diocletian and the Tetriarchy. So, eventually Diocletian, he's a general, and he came into power, and he devised a plan to basically stay alive during this period, and he decided to share his power with his other potential rivals. So instead of trying to, kill them or fend them off, he decided to just share the role of empire with his rivals. So in 293, he established the Tetriarchy, which is the rule by 4. So 4 different people ruled Rome during this time. And he adopted the title of Augustus of the East. And the other 3 tetriarchs were, the Augustus of the West, and then Eastern and Western Caesars. So, and a lot of times the 2 Augusti actually cemented their political relationship, by marrying each other's daughters. And they were ruled without trouble until Diocletian retired. after Diocletian retired, civil war erupted. They had a lot of civil unrest, and the Roman Empire would remain divided into eastern and western sections after this. And actually, the eastern was more Greek, which they called Byzantium, and then the west was Latin, so the Latin West. That's kind of how they divided that up. So we'll take a look at the portrait of the 4 Tetriarchs from Constantinople, 300 CE. So this statue is actually made of purple marble. It almost looks like bronze, but it's actually a purple marble. And there are 2 pairs of figures that kind of huddle together, grasping each other, and they also are holding their swords, as you can see. And they're not individuals. There's really no emotion in their faces. It's hard to tell them apart. A couple of them do have beards, which probably represent some of the older emperors that were ruling. I don't know if he has a beard or not, and they're definitely not done in the classical style at all. It's much more primitive. The figures are kind of squat, and these figures are conceived in a more general and iconic way, and not in the individual classical way that they've done things in Rome for a long time under the influence of Greek art, basically. So this is just kind of another example of the departure from the classical Greek style that we will see more and more in the late Empire. So when Diocletian retired in 305, he moved to his hometown where he was born, and which is basically in former Yugoslavia, and he built this large palace at Split on the Adriatic coast. And it's basically this heavily fortified palace, these large, tall, thick walls. And this is probably because it was such a kind of a dangerous time to be in Rome. Really, it was just unstable at this time. So his palace kind of mirrors that, or reflects that it was a very kind of turbulent time. So this whole complex covered around 10 acres. And there's basically 2 avenues inside that kind of intersect the interior. And then he also had a colonnaded court that led into the imperial residence, which looked like a temple on its facade, which I'm kind of having a hard time finding that. It might be here. So you can see all the columns here and here. And so, let's see. And it had a pediment with an arch in it. And inside the temple, Diocletian presented himself as if he were a god. Or it's not really a temple, it's the imperial residence that resembled a temple. But inside of it, he presented himself as if he were a god. On one side of the court was the temple of Jupiter. On the other side was Diocletian's domed octagonal mausoleum, which is basically a very large tomb, which I believe is right here. That's easy to find. And dome tombs of this type became very popular in late antiquity, especially in the Byzantine Empire. And actually, Diocletian's mausoleum is actually a church today. So, okay, moving on. So we'll talk about Constantine. After Diocletian retired, there was a period of unrest for around 20 years, and eventually Constantine I, the son of Dulcian's Caesar of the West, came into power, along with Licinius, the co-emperor, which would be Constantine's co-emperor to the east. So Constantine and Licinius were ruling after Diocletian. So instead of 4 emperors, there are now 2. And they actually issued the Edict of Milan, which was very important. It basically ended the persecution of the Christians. So that had been going on for a long time. And with Constantine and Licinius, they ended the persecution of the Christians with the Edict of Milan. And eventually Constantine defeats Licinius as ruler of Rome, and then he founds a new Rome and builds a new city at Constantinople, which means city of Constantine. And in 325, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. So really, Constantine is the first Christian emperor. This was something that was happening for a long time, kind of under the surface. The influence of Christianity was slowly seeping into the Roman Empire, but now it's finally become, the main religion under Constantine. And in fact, Constantine was baptized on his deathbed in 337. So this transition into Christianity is actually the marker of the beginning of the medieval age. So with Constantine, we're ushering in medieval times. So we're going to talk about the Basilica Nova in Rome, Italy. It's something that Constantine built, and it's in the Roman Forum, and it's the first thing built since the Severans, which was, I believe, a 2nd century family that ruled from Africa, I believe, originally. And it was a massive structure, this basilica. It was 300 feet long and 215 feet wide. It had brick-faced concrete walls 20 feet thick, and it supported this coffered barrel vault in the aisles. So coffers are those indentations like we saw on the Pantheon, probably to take away some of the mass of the arched roof over these things. And then the vaults also buttress the groin vaults in the nave, and which is 115 feet high. Marble slabs, stuccos covered the walls and floors, so it was very nicely dressed. And the Roman builders applied the lessons learned from constructing baths and market halls to this basilica. And it also had concrete groin vaults, fenestrated concrete groin vaults that kind of replaced the clear story up here. And I'm not quite sure what fenestrated means. It is a term in the book. I think it just means possibly fenced in or something, these groin vaults. And that would let the light in. And that is kind of replacing the clear story that originated in Egypt. So, okay, we'll move on. And you can see the interior, what it might have looked like with the marble. So it's kind of interesting to look at. And then Constantine also built an audience hall as part of his palace complex. And it was called the Aula Palatina. And you can see the hall is very simple, unlike the Basilica Nova. It has this wooden coffered ceiling, so the coffers are the recesses, probably to reduce weight. And also it does create a nice pattern on the wall. And it doesn't have any aisles. It's just totally open. It's actually, and the ceiling is 95 feet high, and the windows provide a lot of light into the interior. There are 2 stories of windows. And at the end, there's kind of an arch here, and then another kind of rounded apse area. And its interior is really serious and severe, but you kind of can imagine this with mosaics and marble plaques and some more marble facing on it instead of just brick. And that would make it look a little bit more decorative than it does now, but that's originally what it would have looked like. It would have had more decoration and embellishment than it does now. So it would have looked a little less severe in its time. Okay, and the exterior is definitely just as severe as the interior. It's made out of brick, but the windows add to it a lot. They have lead-framed glass panes, and they liven it up. They add a little bit of movement and pattern, and you can see the use of the arch is prevalent, and the design is definitely very much like early Christian churches, so we're going to see a lot more Christian influences moving forward.